I'd like to thank Speech in the Silence for this opportunity to do a reading from my new book, Forgotten Templars, The Untold Origins of Ordo Templi Orientis. The selection I've chosen explains that Theodore Reuss was not alone in being interested in sex magic. Given that Reuss and his organization are so strongly associated with sex magic, the denial of having conducted some kind of sexual initiation may seem incredible. After all, Reuss had published a book on phallicism, written about women in Freemasonry, advertised a journal on sexual reform, and would only a few years later publish in the 1912 Oriflamme that the central secret of OTO dealt with sex. All of this begs the question of whether these ideas originated, at least in part, with Kellner, or if Reuss subsequently introduced new concepts to the mix. Unfortunately, not enough is known about Kellner's ideas and what he promoted in his occult circle to say with complete certainty. Shortly after Kellner's death, however, Maximilian Dotzler wrote to both Held and Adriani that, quote, Dr. Kellner and Theodor Reuss had received the same knowledge from sources very independent of one another, end quote. These sources including Rosicrucianism and the Orient, and that, quote, in the year 1895 and then in 1899, these two men compared their mutual knowledge, and from this arose in 1902 the secret of our order that both of you by no means know, and that I, too, say quite openly still do not fully grasp. End quote. While Dotzler's statement purports that Kellner and Reuss shared the knowledge of some secret teaching, it is unclear whether this refers to yoga or something else. Both men, if only through their contact with the Theosophical Society, were without question acquainted with yoga. Kellner had published one of the earliest Western papers on the topic, while Reuss had penned a paper on prana therapy. Whether Kellner's yogic work emphasized the parts of the subtle body that corresponded to the physical sex organs, as did Reuss, is unclear. Similarly, while Kellner is known to have been in contact with individuals and groups practicing sacred sexuality, there is no certainty, beyond the assertions of Reuss, that Kellner himself was exposed to or adopted those practices. However, Dotzler's letter to Held and Adriani goes on to make some other statements that the secret of the occult circle involved more than yoga, which was presented as something entirely unrelated to Freemasonry. Pointing to Kellner's article on esotericism and Freemasonry, Dotzler asserted, quote, in this article it is clearly understood that we have something that is not found in any ritual or order textbook. The mystery was therefore brought in from outside of our order, that is, the true interpretation of the lost word of the order has been returned to us. For without our secret of the occult circle, a really true interpretation of the Masonic secret and the lost word are just not found in any existing Masonic ritual. This is not hard, but I think this undeniable truth I have heard not only from Mr. Reuss, but I have also read it in a letter of Dr. Kellner to Reuss. End quote. Dotzler's statement is echoed in a letter sent by Aleister Crowley to Henri Bervin a quarter century later, where he writes, quote, so far as the OTO is at all concerned with Masonry, it is that the whole of the knowledge of the 33 degrees of the reduced rite is incorporated in the first 7 degrees of the OTO, but the degrees superior to the 7th of OTO contain a vital magical secret, at which the whole of Masonry of any rite certainly hints, though it is nowhere openly disclosed. It is possible, and indeed probable, that many high-grade Masons knew this secret, but communicated it only to their intimates by word of mouth, and not in open lodge. End quote. All of this begs the question, where did OTO get its central secret? Reuss and Crowley were hardly unique in their interest in sacred sexuality. Religious movements throughout history have connected the sacred and the erotic, and Western culture in the late 19th century experienced a period of sexual awakening. As Foucault commented in his History of Sexuality, What is peculiar to modern societies, in fact, is not that they consigned sex to a shadow existence, but that they dedicated themselves to speaking of it ad infinitum while exploiting it as the secret." End quote. To provide some cultural context for the era on the subject of sex, this is also the time when the sexual writings of Krafft-Ebing and Freud also emerged in Austro-Hungary. Coupled with this, an enormous, both in size and influence, literature on the sexual basis of religion flourished from 1865 through the 1930s. A reading list prepared by Royce around 1914 includes many of the seminal texts on phallicism: Knight, Dulaar, Famin, Inman, Jennings, Forlong, Campbell, and Howard, all of which were available in Kellner's lifetime. Royce himself had published a translation of the volume Phallism as Lingam Yoni. Nor was Royce the only OTO founder to write on the spiritual aspect of sex. As early as 1888, while writing of his planned theosophical convent, Hartmann asserted the necessity of a mixed-sex membership for an esoteric society. Quote, "The female element is as necessary to attain perfection as the male one, and in the absence of all temptation there is no opportunity to develop strength. Those who do not dare to come into the presence of a woman without running the risk of being overpowered by their sensuality are very weak indeed. Want of resistance and solitude breeds monkish imbecility and encourages a disordered imagination." End quote. In 1896, Hartmann penned an unsigned article on, quote, "the demon lover of theosophy," end quote, detailing how a, quote, "lover of another world could have a physical body which is created by the mind," end quote, that invariably leads to ruin for those who fail to understand, quote, "the significance of occult wedlock and who can control thoughts of evil instead of having evil thoughts control them," end quote. In addition, shortly after Kellner's death, Hartmann published his paper, "The Secrets of Procreation and Determining the Sex of a Child Before Birth." In it, he discusses how one can use a scientific principle, known by countless ranchers and explicated 3 centuries earlier by Paracelsus, to determine the sex of a child. Quote, "If we are to explain the effect of this law scientifically, it is necessary to penetrate a little deeper into the realm of psychology, or, to say it straight out, into the realm of magic, because the ability of reproduction in humans and animals is indeed a magical force. It is actually the only of the original magical powers." End quote. According to Hartmann, by using will and imagination, one can materialize a mental picture down to a lower octave of physical existence through application of the life force, prana, or liquor vitae. Quote, "It is present everywhere in the blood, especially in the seminal fluid and aura seminalis." End quote. Through the application of these principles, Hartmann argued, it was possible to determine the sex of a child. From there, it is a very short walk to conceiving of wider magical applications. Practical sex magic was also discussed in other contemporary books not far removed from Hartmann and colleagues. Among the best known of these are the works of Sebald, whom Royce also cites. The works of Maximilian Ferdinand Sebald von Werth dealt with Aryan sexual religion, while his follow-up, the 5-volume Genesis, quote, "treated of eroticism, bacchanalia, libido, and mania within a racist and sexological context," end quote. The first 2 books were published in 1897 by Wilhelm Friedrich, who also published theosophical works by Franz Hartmann and others. They were also illustrated by Fidus, who also provided cover illustrations for several of Hartmann's works, as well as graphic designs for the ITV's Theosophical Culture. Other works are less known than Sebald's, but equally relevant. In 1910, Antoine Charot de Mailly found sex everywhere when he wrote about erotic symbols in Freemasonry. The triangle represented man, woman, and child. The 2 pillars represented the male-female sexual polarity. The flaming star symbolized the principle of life. The letter G stood for generation, and the rose cross symbolized the phallus, an argument made in any number of other works in the literature of phallicism. Most amusing was that all of this sexual symbolism in Damai's mind accounted for Freemasonry's philanthropic endeavors focusing so much on abandoned children, mothers, and orphanages. In his bibliography of sex rites and customs, Goodland cites 8 references to, quote, Masonic phallism, end quote, in Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. In 1914, Royce wrote to Chevalier Georges Le Clement de Saint-Marc, quote, to assure him that the sexual secret of the Ordo Templi Orientis was in perfect accordance with what Le Clement had presented in his L'Euchariste, namely, that the secret basis of Catholicism was that at the Last Supper, Christ had actually shared his sperm with the apostles. Finally, we have previously discussed how sexual initiation victim Peter Christoph Martens would go on to found the Neuen Graalorden, into which Ernst Peichmann introduced sex magic. Given this vast literature, in the end, the surprising fact is not that OTO incorporated sacred sexuality into its magical practice, but that anybody at all was shocked by it.